I'm delighted to welcome Bob Maley of Black Kite to this episode of CRO Wisdom. Bob, welcome to this episode.
Glad to be here. It's a pleasure.
So, Bob, let's first talk about your background. I think the audience would really appreciate because you don't have a typical risk background. So, tell us a little bit more about how you got here.
That's a long story, but I'll try to make it short. I think my introduction to risk was a long time ago in a physical sense when I was a police officer. We looked at instantaneous life and death risk situations. And I loved it. It was a great thing. I went down into the computer line, not really as a risk professional. I got involved in a technical fashion, software development, forensics. But as I kept getting exposed to different things and moving through different organizations, for instance, I think my first touch on risk was when I was the coordinator for information technology at the Pennsylvania Healthcare Cost Containment Council, that we started to have to look at the data that we collected, and we had to analyze a lot around privacy, a risk base of, because essentially we sold the data as well that we collected, and evaluating the risk of selling it to certain organizations. So that's kind of how I dovetailed into it, which led to my big exposure to risk management was when I became the CISO at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I was responsible for all the governance, risk, and compliance efforts for the entire Commonwealth, all 47 state agencies and commissions and boards. So that's really where I cut my teeth on it, learned about it. After that, I kind of formalized it in a consulting way. I started, that's my introduction into the financial world, doing consulting with Wells Fargo. And I was already a member of ISACA, Certified Information Security Manager. So I moved that into, I got when the C-Risk certification became available, I certified there. Which then brought me into PayPal, into third-party risk. I built their global third-party risk management program, and that's kind of how I got here. It's a long story, but it took a long time.
Right. So, Bob, I remember I met you when you were at PayPal. Talk a little bit about the role you serve today.
The role I serve today, I am the Chief Security Officer for Black Kite. And it's a small tech startup. So I have quite a large department. There's three of us. There's me, myself, and I. So I am the Chief Privacy Officer, the Chief Risk Officer, the Chief Security Officer, all those things combined. So it's a very different view of risk. I know. At PayPal, I got involved with the mergers and acquisition programs, and it was some significant things. But now it's still just as fun, but it's in a different scale.
Right. So, Bob, talk to us about in this business environment, kind of in this risk environment. What are your key priorities? What are you focused on?
Well, ransomware, I think, and it's not just from what I read, it's what we see in our platform where we do a lot of threat intel collection and understanding the bad actor point of view. It's what we do is we kind of think like the bad actors. And, I learned this back in law enforcement. It was a long time ago. And we had bad actors then. They were looking to do criminal activity to get money. And nothing's really changed since law enforcement days other than the tools and the methodologies that they do. They always looked at what was the easiest, most, and bad actors typically are risk averse, getting arrested. So they looked at, how they could do the least risky ways of getting the biggest returns. And it's that way today. And I see, that I think ransomware is one of those things. And I think there's something that's changing, and we've seen it with SolarWinds, is that going after third parties is not new, relatively. It really started getting people's attention, with the Target breach. That it was an attack of scale that I call it. It was the bad actors. I don't believe started out looking at the target company as their primary victim. They happened to compromise a small HVAC company in Pennsylvania, and they found some credentials that they thought, oh, well, what will these credentials get us into? And they saw what they could see, and they go, oh, well, can we see more? And they kind of leveraged that until they realized they could get into the development systems. And that's where they really leveraged their attack by installing their malware into their update for the card readers at all their stores all over. So they scaled it. And, SolarWinds, while it's a little different, not really. They saw a way that they could compromise a third party that would give them avenues into thousands of other organizations. So, it's those types of things. Those are, for me, that's the biggest thing on my mind today.
Yeah. So Bob, very clearly, if we think about kind of the set or the old risk management practices regarding third parties, they've been so focused on point-in-time assessments. You and I've had many conversations about this and with John Bree. And COVID kind of made it even more clear how these assessments done a month ago, 6 months ago, 12 months ago, were not so relevant as things change and things continue to do that. Talk to us about your views on this. First of all, how can one be more continuous in their risk management approach? And what do you see as kind of pros and cons of that? What is it solving? What challenges it might be creating?
Well, point in time. That's obviously 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago. That was pretty much how we did third-party risk. We sent out the questionnaires, we collected the artifacts, we looked at their SOC 2, other audit certifications, and the big issue with, and I remember with some of the regulators that, well, what's your program for reassessing? And so we had our vendors classified. We had the critical vendors, and we reassessed them once a year. The medium vendors twice a year, and in the program, those low risk vendors were every 3 years, which essentially never really happened.
Unless there was a bad incident.
Yeah, if there's an incident, there's always a change when there's an incident that happens. But I look at that and the move towards continuous monitoring. And obviously the bad actors are very quick, they're very agile. You've heard me talk about the OODA loop before, the strategic principles of observe, orient, decide, and act. And if you're executing your OODA loop faster than your competition, you're winning. And in this case, I think the bad actors, they execute that loop extremely fast. They are very agile. They don't have to go and get someone's approval to try something. They just do it. If they see something that's of value, the networks that they've created today, they don't have to learn new technologies. They go out to another branch of Crime Inc. And they hire some other bad actors who have an expertise to be able to get through and turn and monetize what they've discovered. So they're doing it. They are constantly iterating and getting better, and that's where continuous monitoring, especially not just in an enterprise view, but in third parties, is critical. But that also introduces a lot of challenges as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about cyber, but very clearly from a chief risk officer, cyber is not the only thing. There are multiple other types of third-party risk, but for me in the world I live in today with Black Kite, cyber is our focus. And I just Poneman just released a new report on threat intel. And one of the things that I saw about that is that everybody believes that threat intel is extremely important. and it is. We all agree on that.
Yeah.
But the volume of data that you get, open source intelligence, it's intelligence that you collect yourself. Being able to do something with that volume of data, that's the challenge today. That's in continuous monitoring. I think that's the biggest challenge.
Yeah. And Bob, I think that's the beauty of today's tools that are available. I was talking to Jim Routh, as you know, formerly at Aetna and Mass Mutual, and the ability to use data science and automation to actually take all these feeds, and you can automate a significant amount of risk actions. I know when you think about cyber, you guys are doing that, right? That's an approach that I know you kind of think about and you take.
Well, exactly. That's one of the first things that we do. And one of the things that brought me to Black Kite was the introduction of something called FAIR, the Factor Analysis of Information Risk. In my career, I was trained to talk about risk in qualitative methods. We're technical. We understand high risk. We know if it's red, it's bad. Right. But in reality, that really isolates the technical, the CISO that thinks that way from the chief risk officer, because there's different languages. The language of risk, outside of cyber, is in business impact. And the ability to be able to communicate cyber instead of in that old qualitative way, to be able to talk in dollars and cents. That's for me was the game changer that I got excited about, to be able to scale that. I know, I'm a certified in FAIR. I've done a lot of research on that. We actually just, we were awarded a patent last week about the process that we do of collecting all that intel, all that data, and how we scale that and turn that into realistic, probable financial impact that just lets you make better business decisions. And that's why I'm excited about the industry, is adding that AI. And there's other things that we're doing around that, because, I've been a practitioner. I've managed 1,400 assessments a year with 80 on-sites. And I know the volume of information you just collect in an assessment process. I'm going to collect your, let's say I'm going to get your information security policies. I want to get your SOC 2. I want to get your ISO certifications. I've collected all that information, and there's so much good intel in those artifacts. But what do I do with it? When we had 294 assessments, we actually analyzed that information. But when you scale the number of assessments that you have to do, but your team doesn't scale, then it starts to become essentially, a checklist process that, we're going to trust that their SOC 2 auditor, did a good job. But a SOC 2 report doesn't mean that they're 100% perfect in their controls. You have to understand where they're lacking in that SOC 2 to make it valuable, and being able to automate those types of things. I think, for a chief risk officer or CISO, I think that's what's really valuable.
Yeah, Bob, one of the things that's always stood out for me about you is you don't think of this risk management role as a chief security officer, as a compliance officer. You think of that as an operations risk and resilience leader, right?
Absolutely. If you don't, you're very narrow, and at some point it's going to come back on you. I know that because of past situations where, going to a business unit and telling them that, you really can't use this vendor because they're high risk.
Right.
What does that mean? Well, coming from a technical perspective, it totally goes over their head, and you lose the battle, because there is a business value, an operational value to use that vendor. And unless I can talk in that language and help them, bring them to the same understanding that I have, that's the challenge. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, you can't be the chief resistance officer.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, or you can't be the information security office of no.
Yeah, exactly. So Bob, talk about very clearly cyber risk, high priority, right? Very clearly, COVID also opened companies' eyes about thinking about supply chain perspective, location risk. talk about some of the other risk categories that you are seeing that you feel chief risk officers ought to be paying attention to.
Well, and I think COVID brought this one up too. It's financial stability of companies, having the ability to understand the changes, because you can look at their annual report, and that's a snapshot. And as you're a businessman, you know how quickly things can change, and these are all indicators that cyber may be good. But then if that financial stability or ability of that company starts to degrade, that's naturally going to cascade. Cyber will become a victim of that at some point, simply because of, programs being cut. I remember in 2008, award-winning program, cyber security program, that I got approached. And I was advised that, well, your budget needs to be cut. And I know that you have a really capable, multi-layered security approach, but you're going to have to cut one of those layers because we don't have the budget. And, being able to see that ahead of time. So that's why, the cascading financial, I think, is that solvency. That's critical. And depending upon the nature of the companies, location risk as well. Where are your suppliers located? I got exposed to that back in PayPal. That one of the things that I learned about resiliency for call centers, for instance. So, the way that PayPal helped, they built a resiliency around that for economies of scale, there's certain parts of the world where call centers are easier to run. They're less expensive, the second level call center. But some of those parts of the world are subject to different types of risk, political risk, political unrest, or, if it's not in the Pacific, it's not a hurricane. What is it?
Typhoon.
Typhoon. Typhoon comes through Manila, and the ability to be able to rapidly move from one region to another part that's not subject to that same weather risk. So being able to understand all those types of things, and again, we may not think that our business has that kind of geolocation risk, but unless we understand our critical vendors, what they're supplying for us, and where they're located. We may be totally central to North America, but we may have a supplier that isn't. And if something happens to them in another part of the world, that's important as well.
Yeah. So Bob, one of the other challenges that I see in the profession is that if you think about intelligence inputs regarding risk intelligence inputs into a company, compliance has their own provider, procurement has their own financial kind of health provider, cyber CISO office might have their cyber susceptibility. And then you might have, another area now with ESG coming on board, ESG, somebody else is looking at it. And so all of a sudden, when you're looking at your third party, you're not getting an integrated view. What are your thoughts on that, kind of pros and cons of that?
Well, it's tough to get that integrated view, simply because, especially in larger organizations, a lot of times there's those silos, the territories that, resiliency may look at things in one particular way. Cyber looks at it in another, procurement in another, and they sometimes don't play or work well together. It's one of the initiatives I got a chance to work on at PayPal. Was it was a multifunctional third-party working group, risk working group that included all of those stakeholders. And through that process, it was the storming, understanding what those challenges were and why those different groups had different reasons for wanting to do things, but then working through that. So it's extremely valuable once you do that, because then you get that bigger holistic picture. But learning how to do that, understanding why. But it comes back to understanding what the business goal is of using third parties. And ultimately, everybody's going to have the same goal. Resiliency obviously is that my critical vendors. If I lose one, I need to know which ones are resilient. But cyber, on the other hand, they're more interested in, well, we don't want our data being exfiltrated from a vendor. And procurement, they're concerned about the contracts. Do we have the right contracts in place? Do we have are we spreading out too many vendors? Should we concentrate vendors, or are they too concentrated? But the ultimate goal is the bottom line for the business. And when we can understand that, I think it's a little bit easier path to bring those disparate folks into the same program, so to speak.
Right. So exciting field. In fact, Bob Bloomberg in a recent article said, risk manager is a hot job. What do you think?
I got to tell you, a risk manager in a cyber tech startup, I don't know if it's a hot job or not, but it's exciting. I've always been one of those folks that I love building things. I love building programs. And when the program's built and it's time to operationalize and run it, I love handing that off to someone else. But we have to look at the way the world is today. And, we've talked about it in the cyber world. It all started out, well, we have to have that hard, crunchy exterior. We can't let them inside. And then we started realizing, well, yeah, they're going to get inside. So we have to have multi-layers of defense. And then we started realizing that, well, our ecosystem is bigger than just us. It's all the third parties. So those things change. And if we can look at that in a risk perspective, in being able to understand what are the real risks, what are the real impacts to our business. And that's why I think it makes that the CRO such a valuable role, is if we can speak in those languages that the business understands, that the board understands. Not only are we helping our career, but we're helping the business that we work for. And it's the combination of all those things that I think it's exciting. I'm loving it.
Hot job, and maybe also a hot seat.
Well, it's always a hot seat. I've been a CISO. I know a CISO. That's a hot seat. And I imagine the chief risk officer will be too, simply because sometimes people like to speak in absolutes. That they want us to be prognosticators, that we can actually predict what's going to happen. Well, we can't predict, but we can, as a chief risk officer, we can understand what the likelihood, what the probabilities of risk are, and help our business folks make better business decisions. And if we take that approach, I think maybe if we're doing it right, maybe the seat's not quite so hot.
Right.
If we claim that we can predict risk, it might get hot.
Right. So Bob, very clearly you have a growth mindset, excited to continue to learn. So what resources do you rely on to make yourself a better risk leader?
Well, one of the biggest resources is shared assessments, and it's not just the tools; it's the learning they have. But what I find really valuable is the intellectual sharing that happens in the working groups, in the meetings. That I know that our views can become rather narrow when we're only focused on our own little world, At PayPal, I had the luxury of seeing a global view. I worked with business units from all the different countries. And Australia, they look at things very differently in Australia than we do here, and in Asia Pacific and in Germany. And I had those things then, but now with shared assessments, that's one of those biggest things that I look at. Obviously. There's a lot of leaders that I follow, thought leaders, Phil Venables. I love reading what he has to say about what's going on in the world and others. And it's just trying to keep up that way. It's tough because you have your day-to-day, but you have to make sure that you are constantly exposing yourself to other frames of reference, other thought processes, and other views. Because if we lock ourselves into our preconceived notions about what risk is, it's interesting. I still run across folks that risk matrices and the qualitative view, that's the only way to do it. And I've been there, so I understand why. But locking yourself into that, not looking further at better ways to communicate to the business, it's extremely important to keep your mind open.
Right. No, Bob, I think I totally agree. You know, even for myself, for the last decade, shared assessment has been a great resource for me. And serving on the board for those years, meeting people like you that bring all those views together and share so openly in these working groups has been, I think, has been a gift for leaders like me. So, Bob, a final question for you. And thank you so much for making time for us. A final question for you. What advice would you give to future risk leaders as somebody who's interested in risk, wants to build a career? How should you think about their career, and especially as they want to keep moving up?
Well, it's embrace change. I really think that's probably the number one thing is that if you get into a static process, that you're really not going to advance because, I talk about it. I look at the career advancement the same way as the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. And things change so quickly in the risk industry, how we look at risk, what different risks are, 13 months ago. Our view of third-party risk was very different than it is today, but having the willingness to embrace change, I think, that's probably the biggest thing for somebody that wants to be a CRO. They should, if they're dead set against change, in my view, may not be the best career to get into.
Well, Bob Maley, Chief Security and Risk Officer of Black Kite, thank you so much for making time for us. Really appreciated talking to you.
My pleasure.